and thank you for joining the second discussion in this year's Land Dialogue webinar series organised in partnership with the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation,
this meeting is being recorded,
Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. The initiative promotes the importance of recognising legal ownership of Indigenous peoples and local communities' land rights as a prerequisite for achieving national and international goals for forest governance, food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. This Land Dialogue series will run across 4 webinars from May to November, with each webinar tackling a different topic. I'm Anastasia Maloney, the Latin America correspondent for the Thomson Reuters Foundation in Bogota, and I'm delighted to be your host today. We're talking about where technology meets land rights, utilising technologies to support land governance. Indigenous peoples and local communities are using innovative technology solutions, and increasingly, we're finding communities are integrating their traditional knowledge, skills and values with digital and satellite tools that support them in their efforts to secure their ancestral territories. I myself was recently in Ecuador's Amazon rainforest, where I had the privilege to speak to Indigenous leaders about how they've embraced technology to help them protect their territory. And whether it's using GPS tools and drones to map their lands and using digital tools to monitor who's entering their land, where and when, technology is increasingly being used by forest communities across the world. While the use of digital tools has the potential to contribute to improving land governance, there are also risks. And we'll today be asking questions like, where does technology meet land rights? And once it does, what are the potential benefits and drawbacks? And while we can all agree that tech can be used for good, what are the risks? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the panel today. I'll hand over to each one of them for some opening remarks. We'll then have a discussion for about an hour and finally take questions from the audience, which will take us to just about 90 minutes. The webinar will take place in English and be simultaneously interpreted into Spanish, French, and Portuguese. To access this, please use the channels located at the bottom of your screen. If you do have questions, please post them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat box feature, and then I'll yield those questions to the panelists. Also, feel free to use the hashtag #LandDialogues and follow live tweeting from Land Portal and Tenure Facility Twitter accounts. And finally, in the interest of transparency, I should say that today's session is being recorded and you'll be receiving the link afterwards. So on to our expert panelists. Firstly, Frank Pichal. He's co-founder and chief programs officer at Cadastre. Frank is a land administration specialist with experience in designing, managing, and implementing land-related projects with a technology focus around the globe. He has worked both with the private sector, while based in West Africa, and as well as designing and managing programs as part of the Land Tenure and Property Rights Office, the US Agency for International Development. I also have on the panel Harold Leversage. He's a lead land tenure technical specialist at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, with over 30 years of experience in land and natural resource governance issues, mainly in Eastern and Southern Africa. In his current capacity, he's responsible for assisting IFAD to better address land and natural resource tenure security issues in the projects and programs it supports. And this includes its engagement in regional and global initiatives, such as the Africa Land Policy Initiative and the voluntary guidelines for the governance of tenure and the Global Donor Land Working Group. And last but not least, we have Alicia Quintero from Panama, the organization CONAPIP, which is a leading organization representing the 12 leaders of the councils that represent Panama's 7 indigenous peoples. Its mandate is to unite indigenous people under one national agenda and present proposals at the national and international level. So let's kick off today's session. I'd like to turn to Harold. Harold, can you give us some takeaways, please, from the recent IFAD event on applying frontier technologies to secure land rights? And also, could you tell us a bit more about the Geotech 4 tenure work being spearheaded by IFAD, please? Good morning, Harold.
Hi, Anastasia. Thanks very much for that introduction. So the side event on applying frontier technologies to secure land rights was actually a sort of a spin-off of our Geotech for Tenure project. So I'll start with that. The Geotech for Tenure project is a peer-to-peer learning platform that's exploring how technology can or should be combined with participatory methods for social empowerment in securing land and natural resource rights. It's being developed jointly by IFAD and FAO, along with our other partners, FAO being the Food and Agricultural Organization. At the moment, it is an online learning platform focusing on partners in the projects and programs we are supporting, mainly our government and civil society partners, but we hope to eventually involve a broader pool of partners and to develop a permanent service, including providing technical support at project and community level, so not just being online. We are covering all dimensions of tenure, from collective or group rights to individual and familial rights, and we are also exploring tools for securing women's land rights, improving youth access to land, etc. And we think our Geotech for Tenure initiative is potentially a very powerful tool for forging partnerships at community and project level. So as I said, the one-day learning event on frontier technology was sort of a spin-off from our Geotech for Tenure project. And in this event, we wanted to explore more the different technologies that are being used for recording land and natural resource rights. And what we realized is that there has been a lot of very interesting work done by a range of practitioners in using technology going back over several decades. In fact, people involved in surveying and mapping land and natural resource rights were among the early users of technological solutions, such as some of those that you mentioned, global information systems or GIS, global navigation satellite systems or global positioning systems, GPS, but also using satellite imagery, aerial photography, and more recently, mobile smartphone applications and unmanned aerial vehicles, popularly known as drones, and most recently, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and distributed ledger technology, such as blockchain. What we did was to interview some of the practitioners that have been testing and developing these solutions. And we've spoken to a wide range of people from the international development agencies, international professional bodies, academia, private sector service providers, and civil society organizations. And what we found, I guess, is not so surprising, but the first was that there are no standalone solutions. Technologies are most effective when they're used in combination. And related to this, some technologies have proven to be more successful, more useful than others. Perhaps more importantly, all the people we interviewed confirmed that the use of technology has to be integrated with participatory methods for social empowerment, involving the land rights holders themselves. Secondly, we found that technology use must consider the enabling factors and long-term sustainability of use. So do the policies and laws in a country allow for the use of technology for land recordation by local users? What are the requirements for capacity development? How will records be kept up to date? Who will manage the data, etc.? Thirdly, building on this, the last main finding was that it's not actually about the technology. In fact, most people emphasize that the focus should be on developing appropriate, culturally sensitive and agile land and natural resource management solutions that take into account the specific country and local context. Several of the interviewees we spoke to emphasized that the main challenges are not technological. In fact, they're more about things like the recognition of diverse tenure systems by governments and the development of strong community and local government land administration systems, and the enabling factors needed for this that I referred to earlier. So overall, the main term that most people referred to was finding fit-for-purpose solutions. I hope I've I've been able to justify and give an overview of the main points that came up. All in all, the discussions have been very rich, and we hope to forward to continue exploring these issues with others. Thank you, Anastasia.
Thanks very much, Harold, for that overview. And I think you make an important point that I think we'll hear a lot during the session, that, as you say, technology is most effective when it's in combination with other solutions, and it shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet for land tenure issues. If I could stick with you, Harold, I'd like to get your thoughts on a study in 2020 from the Food First Information and Action Network, FIAN, and it shows that despite promises to fix unjust land governance, digital technologies can exacerbate or further land grabbing and inequality. Can you give us your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, I think indeed the FIAN study highlights some of the main challenges. Very good study. And in fact, we're actually using it in our Geotech for Tenure training to highlight some of the challenges and pitfalls. In the end of the day, technology is a tool, and it depends on who is using the tool. The tool can, in fact, be used for greater top-down social control. And as the FIAN study highlights, technology has sometimes been used or resulted in land grabbing and greater inequality. However, I must say there are also many examples of the technology being used to democratize and rapidly scale up the recognition of local indigenous people's land rights, especially in the developing world. So, for example, some of the partners that we've been discussing and sharing their experiences are JKPP in Indonesia, the Community Mapping Network in Indonesia, or the Instituto del Bien Común in Peru, the Philippines Association for Intercultural Development, Terra Firma, a private sector company in Mozambique with its partners, and then Cadastre, who of course Frank will share, others such as FAO using the solutions for open land administrations, or SOLAR, UN Habitat using the social tenure domain model, to mention a few. And so there have been some very rich experiences in using technology to secure indigenous peoples, local communities, land and natural resource rights. Again, the key for success is ensuring that the technology is placed in the hands of local communities who want to secure their land rights, which, as I've already said, was our starting point when we were grappling with these issues. So,
Thank you.
Yes, please, over to you.
Thank you, Harold. And finally, my last question, which also I'll be asking the other panelists. A key open data issue is the rights of Indigenous people to control information and data about themselves and their land, individually and collectively. I think the key issue for many practitioners is how can we balance openness when it comes to data about land rights with Indigenous data sovereignty?
Yeah, I think this is a challenging one that I don't have all the answers to personally. Again, the key is about how Indigenous peoples and local communities have control over the sharing and use of their data. And we need to say that it is their data. I guess the challenge is that, as you've alluded by the question, in general, there is a call for greater transparency and openness of data related to who owns what land. And the question is, what does this mean for Indigenous peoples and local communities? I think as a guiding set of principles and practices, the starting point is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and enabling local communities for themselves to decide on what data should be made available. It may be that it is enough for the collective rights of a community to be recorded in a national land information system without giving the particular details of how those rights are allocated within the community. And then for the local community themselves to run a set of records on who owns what land, and including the recording and transferring of those rights within the community or with others. But this depends on the context, the ability to manage such records, and ensuring that the state recognizes such a system for maintaining records. So I guess these are some of the things we are grappling with, but I think people like Frank and others might be better placed to answer how they are managing the data. But actually, some of the people we interviewed thought that this was one of the potential uses of blockchain. By the way, many of the people we spoke to felt that blockchain is not the solution, but some really felt that there could be some potential use of blockchain in this way, where people could transfer their land rights without going through a centralized database. Now, this is quite a subversive idea, but one that needs careful consideration. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Harold. And now I'm going to turn to Elicio. He's calling in from Panama. Elicio, I'm going to ask the same question, if I may, I asked Harold earlier. A study from FIAN shows that despite promises to fix unjust land governance, digital technologies can exacerbate or further land grabbing and inequality. Elicio, can you give us your thoughts on this, please? Let me have a look whether we have Elicio online. If not, then I'll move to our next panelist. Elicio, are you there, please? No, okay. So then while Elicio is going to join us later, Frank, if I could turn to you and ask you the same question. What are your views on the FIAN study and the takeaways there, please?
Thanks very much, Anastasia. And you won't be surprised to hear that my comments don't differ too widely from Harold's. But anytime there's an imbalance in access, whether that's to education, whether that's to governance, frankly, or whether it's technology, there's going to be that potential for abuse. But that said, I think technology, more so than some other issues, has the power to be a democratizer in terms of land information. While it's not perfect or uniformly accessible, the ability for indigenous people, as Harold mentioned some of these examples, to monitor the forest fires within their area, to monitor deforestation, to come to a discussion regarding the carbon sequestration potential within their forests with an informed perspective, is simply something that wasn't there a decade ago. Or on the other hand, a community, as we're doing in Liberia with support from the Swedish land agency, Landmateriet, the ability for communities to access and monitor the stage and formal recognition that they're currently in remotely is something that wouldn't have been imagined just a couple of years ago. So while digital technology, has its risks, it certainly has the power to really promote transparency. And for me, transparency in the systems, the processes, and really the rights around land would be the single biggest deterrent to land grabs. So that combination of being a democratizer and a deterrent to land grabs in combination with the ability to serve as an accelerator for the capture, the visualization, and sharing of data, certainly would make technology's benefits outweigh the risks. Not to dismiss them or not to say we shouldn't always be considering those risks, but I think in light of everything else, we should leverage the technology available.
And also the same question that I've asked Harold, this sort of tension or possible conflict between, how can we balance openness when it comes to data about land rights with indigenous sovereignty? What are your thoughts on that, Frank?
Sure. And that's a very tough question, right? Because on one hand, we really embrace the concepts of open data. But with that is the idea that it's equitable, accessible, transparent, and accurate. And the reality is we don't have that equity and access oftentimes with indigenous and local communities. And with property rights, of course, there is always a tie-in to personal information. A public property right inherently has a name, an entity associated with it, and a location. And in some cases, that data could put organizations and communities at risk. So I think fundamentally, we believe that communities, regardless of where they are, have a right and should have the tools and ability to manage their own data that's local and sensitive to them. That might include access to sacred sites, to water holes, to land use, whatever it might be. But those decisions can be made locally. Now, data relating to property rights, we would stress that as that data is captured, community boundaries or individual boundaries, they need to be captured in line with national standards or international standards, such as the Land Administration Domain Model, where relevant, to ensure that this capture of data that will eventually fit into the public sphere in some way meets the requirements. Because what we don't want is this community mapping to be happening in isolation and with an expectation of an outcome that won't be legally feasible given the operating environments of the countries in question.
Thank you, Frank. And in general, could you just give us a bit more detail and overview about Cadastra's work? What are the exciting projects and work that we can expect to hear about in the following months and years, please?
Sure, happy to. So Cadastra Foundation is somewhat unique in that we are a nonprofit organization, but with a clear technology focus. Part of the reason we are a nonprofit is because of the inherent sensitivity of the data of our partners. It is, and we want to give our partners confidence that it remains their data. While we are a platform and a supporter of those communities, we're not taking their data or using it in ways without their permission. But as a nonprofit, we're relatively young, about 7-8 years old. We come from organizationally a background in formal land administration. But I think what we've seen collectively as a team starting Cadastra was that formal land systems were missing a vast majority in many countries. Smallholders, slum dwellers, indigenous communities, and local groups are often being left out regardless of that system being used. So with Cadastra, the thought was really, how do we provide the tools for collecting data, the platform for managing data, and the technical support to ensure that our partners can reach their goals? Whether, a first step might be advocacy for their rights, with a second leading to leveraging their rights with the private sector or public sector, or finally, those partners are really lead all the way to formal recognition rights. And I think that's where we're most excited about some of our current work is how we're seeing partners, whether working in an urban context in Brazil or Zanzibar, using our tools at a local level by local community members, reaching formal rights, or in rural processes and customary processes, as doing in India, in Uganda, and into Liberia, really serving as that intermediary between bottom-up approaches and top-down national systems and the data standards that the national systems require.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that overview. I'm going to see whether we can hear from Eliseo now. Eliseo, are you with us?
Anastasia, I think what might be helpful here.
Perfecto. Alto y claro.
Here we go. Excellent. Thank you, Eliseo. Wonderful you could join us. So really interested to get your point of view, please, on what we've been talking about, because obviously you have firsthand experience about this in your own indigenous communities in Panama. Eliseo, can I start, please, by asking, so how can we balance openness when it comes to data about land rights with indigenous data sovereignty? Over to you, Eliseo, please.
Bueno, creo que la pregunta es bastante complejo. Tiene dos preguntas en una. Uno, para que sea sociable, amigable, respetable, nosotros lo que hacemos es, primero, como no somos acá intermediarios, nosotros vamos directo. Lo que era intermediario anteriormente, nosotros era una barrera y lo hemos estado desarrollando con tal fin de que las actividades que se generen en los territorios, más en temas de datos, se ha ido homologando poco a poco y también compartiéndolos con las autoridades tradicionales. Esto es de la mano a mano, va directo, y la percepción en el desarrollo de las actividades a medida es un proceso también de socialización y concientización de la importancia de los datos y su liberación, y más para temas de alto perfil o de sensibilidad. En la soberanía de los datos, nosotros todavía no hemos alcanzado esa soberanía como tal con el Estado, porque ha sido un proceso bien complejo, porque muchas de estas informaciones ha sido más que nada secuestrada por las organizaciones, también por empresa privada, también por gobierno, y la cual nos ha costado un poco llegar a este nivel donde estamos nosotros. Nosotros trabajamos de la mano directo con cada uno de los territorios indígenas que en la actualidad, si puedes ver la presentación, vemos un mapa donde actualmente también se habla con hecho y también con derecho, porque muchas de las actividades que se desarrollan se basan también en la logística, en la asistencia técnica, en la capacidad de la gobernabilidad y más que nada directo en las zonas de mayor conflicto. Esto también, como dice el compañero anterior que pude alcanzar a escuchar, sí, mucho de esta información se ve vulnerado, porque no solamente las comunidades indígenas se están empoderando, no solamente nosotros los jóvenes nos hemos encargado de evolucionar lo más rápido posible para alcanzar estos datos y que también sea equilibrado y compartible también con las autoridades. Hace 20 años, 15 años atrás, cuando empezamos esta jornada, era difícil accesar la información. Posterior a eso, una vez que habíamos pasado un proceso de entrenamiento, empezamos a ubicar mucha información para las comunidades y que posiblemente también no teníamos ese alcance si no fuese por el apoyo internacional. En este caso, la FAO, Renfre Foundation, TF y otros aliados internacionales de mucha importancia que nos dio también como ese plus para poder nosotros contribuir a las comunidades indígenas. Hoy día, las comunidades indígenas ya cuentan con sus datos, una base de datos lineales, más que nada son datos de uso político administrativo, y ahora hemos estado actualizando datos que una gran ventaja es los datos abiertos, como lo habías mencionado en una de las preguntas, pero lo interesante de esto es que cada territorio ha estado comprendiendo qué tan oficial pueden ser los datos y qué tan sensibles son los datos en materia de propiedad intelectual, en materia de recursos minerales, en materia de recursos naturales, en materia de zonas endémicas, en materia de zonas digamos, amenazadas. Eso ha creado que en la actualidad la Coordinadora Nacional de Pueblo Indígena de Panamá avance con las pocas herramientas que hemos desarrollado, con pocos instructivos que hemos estado desarrollando, y que también hemos tenido experiencias con acompañamiento de otros pueblos de América del Sur y América del Norte y Centroamérica. Eso ha ayudado bastante también a describir un poquito el futuro, pues, de las comunidades indígenas en el proceso de empoderamiento. Anteriormente, no que quisiera ir en contra del amigo que acaba de hablar, pero una de las cosas más importantes de las comunidades indígenas es que las mismas comunidades también sean capaces de administrar y dominar los recursos tecnológicos que tengan, y más la liberación de la información. Estamos en un proceso de transición también de elevar nuestra información a una plataforma nacional que sea visible, disponible para todo tipo de sociedades, de comunidades que quisieran accesar a la información. Todavía estamos en proceso. Esa es una tarea titánica, ya que en la actualidad no tenemos respaldo de ninguna institución, de ninguna empresa privada, y para llegar a ese nivel requiere bastante recursos y también acompañamiento técnico. Pero la mezcla de conocimiento entre pueblos jóvenes, pues nosotros tenemos una mezcla de conocimiento entre Emberá, Guaunán, Naso, Bribri, Nove, Buglé, Guna y los otros compañeros. Todos nosotros conversamos en diferente idioma, pero sabemos cuáles son los propios objetivos de cada uno de sus territorios, que es salvaguardar la información, ya sea escrita o digital. Ok, esa sería mi respuesta.
Alicia, can I ask you a follow-up question? You mentioned that you're doing a transition to put the information into a national platform. That sounds really important, interesting. However, at the same time, are you also worried about who might be using that information and for what purposes? Because you mentioned earlier that the information has been, you used the word kidnapped, or I'd say taken, seized by the private sector and the government. Are you afraid that if you do put information and data about your communities on the national platform, it might be used in ways that are not advantageous, are not good or beneficial for communities? Could you give us your thoughts about that and how the national platform could work and what it could look like in the future?
Perfecto, muy buena pregunta, me interesa. Eh, primero, ante todo, las autoridades tradicionales y las comunidades indígenas de los 7 pueblos de este país eh, han sido claros. No se puede divulgar ninguna información sensible que vaya a trastocar el material vegetal, trastocar la parte cultural y mucho menos trastocar los recursos naturales que por muchos años han sido protegidas, y más por los sitios arqueológicos o ancestrales. Esta información no estará disponible. Estará disponible capas territoriales, eh, capas de rutas de acceso que son importantes saberle y mencionarle al Estado. Mira, tú no hiciste una promesa de hacernos una vía de acceso para comunicar a una comunidad de la forma más digna posible de asfalto. Mira, esta carretera en la actualidad no me funciona. Mira como cuántos años lleva. Mostrarle mapas sobre la situación de las distintas escuelas. Hay escuelas en la actualidad aquí en Panamá que da lástima que cuando llegamos a una comunidad todavía son escuelas rancho. Por lo menos hay puestos de salud que en las comunidades existen y no tienen un médico, no tienen las condiciones de salud adecuadas y no tienen los recursos necesarios. Por lo menos otro dato importante que se puede destinar: cuánto bosque se está perdiendo diariamente, y el Estado tiene que garantizar de que se minimice esa deforestación. Otro aspecto importante: cuánto área se ha estado las comunidades indígenas comprometidas en el desarrollo de salvaguardar y proteger y recuperar las áreas degradadas, cuánta hectárea se ha estado recuperando año tras año. Y también otro dato importante mostrar es cuánto área se ha estado perdiendo por parte de los colonos y cuál es la presión que existe a nivel de las fronteras entre comunidades indígenas y colonos o campesinos, o áreas que están siendo intervenidas por personas que no creen en la conservación, más están enfocados a generar economía. Si fuese una economía con solidaridad, estable, que permita a la gente también aprovechar el mejor recurso, creo que tendríamos otro escenario. Otro tipo de dato importante sería entonces los proyectos de desarrollo. Ejemplo, hay proyectos de desarrollo como la hidroeléctrica que no están de acuerdo a las comunidades indígenas y se propone como proyecto de desarrollo a 50 años. Hay que mostrarle a las comunidades y los otros territorios que eso es importante mencionarlo, porque en la actualidad nosotros tenemos enlace también con comunidades indígenas de México, alianzas con comunidades de Paraguay, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua y otros amigos que nos dicen: mira, nosotros tenemos un territorio y qué lástima que nuestro territorio está titulado, pero nuestro régimen municipal no va en contra de nuestros derechos. ¿Por qué? Porque permite que también el gobierno pueda otorgarle el permiso a las partes municipales, a los departamentos, que hagan concesiones dentro de nuestra propia tierra que ya ha sido titulado, y somos los que tenemos derecho, pero le dan el derecho de uso a la fuerza para aprovechar esos recursos naturales. Esas son cosas que hay que mostrarle al país, ¿verdad? ¿Y cuánto es el cumplimiento?
Thank you, Alicia. It's very clear that as you were explaining, for Indigenous communities, the control and the ownership of data is a way to hold governments accountable for what they're doing and what not they're doing. For example, the promises that they said that they do, the plans, the development plans, and it's a way to keep check on government plans. And Alicia, one more question, and then we'll open up the discussion. Got some great questions coming through. The last one, as I gave the other panelists, the study by FIAN shows that despite promises to fix unjust land governance, digital technologies can in fact exacerbate or even further land grabbing and inequality. Can you give us your thoughts on this? And if you've had experience of this, the idea that technology can be beneficial, but also has its hazards and risks at the same time?
Bueno, yo creo que la pregunta es exactamente lo que hoy vivimos. Panamá ha estado en un proceso de Bueno, no Panamá, nosotros, la Coordinadora Nacional de Pueblo Indígena de Panamá, hemos estado en un proceso de un esfuerzo muy, muy difícil, donde el control de la información cartográfica y tenencial lo tiene una institución. Y estas personas no solamente se da uso por los datos abiertos, sino por los datos que están ya definidos, la cual ellos generan un desarrollo y tienen una ventaja mucho más que las comunidades indígenas. Ha pasado 4 años. Hace 4 años, los empresarios tenían información sobre todo lo que era el territorio indígena. Incluso sabían dónde podían titular. Incluso establecían mediciones satelitales sin necesidad de tocar 1 centímetro de superficie de tierra en el área. Esto provocó que en la actualidad se generaran muchas denuncias sobre el acaparamiento y ocupación ilegal de tierra. Claro, es así mismo. Las ventajas tecnológicas, si las comunidades indígenas no se empoderan, no desarrollan su propia metodología de salvaguarda para poder avanzar y hacerle frente a esto, hoy día nosotros tuviéramos un problema mucho más grande. Sabe que un fruto importante de este esfuerzo fue hace unos 15 días atrás, de este mismo mes, bueno, del mes pasado, hemos estado dando seguimiento a 2 empresarios bien fuerte económicamente acá en Panamá, la cual llegó a tener contacto directo con tanto la Autoridad Nacional de Tierra en Panamá y tanto los municipios para crear superficie o parcelear o dividir las superficies que ya han sido publicadas ante el Estado, que está en proceso de titulación o en proceso de reconocimiento jurídico. Aún así se atrevieron a hacer un proceso de titulación individual también estos colonos o estas personas que solamente compran tierra y venden, compran tierra y venden. Entonces, esto provocó también que estas personas hicieran concesiones de madera para aprovecharlo de manera simplificada o comunitario, pero en realidad se estaba vendiendo la madera de manera ilegal. No contaban con los permisos adecuados. ¿Qué produjo esto? Gracias a esos datos que hemos estado dándole seguimiento, hoy tenemos respuesta a esa lucha también que se le dio por parte de las comunidades, y estas personas van 4 años de prisión. ¿Verdad? Esto es un resultado interesante y ojalá todos estos casos nos permita a nosotros y le permita al Estado decir que las comunidades hoy día nosotros manejamos la información de los territorios y que permite también identificar si es exactamente estas titulaciones privadas caen dentro de comunidades indígenas o no caen en comunidades indígenas. Esta apropiación ilegal hay que hacerlo fuerte, ¿no? Para que se vaya evitando esto.
Alicia, thank you for that. And that's a really powerful example to show that data can be used as evidence when precisely you have problems with private companies, as you were saying, trying to develop on Indigenous land. And data is certainly being used in court cases to defend Indigenous territory. Thank you, Alicia. So we've heard from our 3 panelists today on the basic questions, but I'd like to now turn to questions that we've got in the chat. And Harold, if I can come to you first, there's a general question which I think is useful for us to answer. And the question is there a land technology standards for the metadata? Are there these standards? Do they exist? Where are they? Do people follow them? Because we've been talking about so many different regions during this discussion. Is there a kind of standard for this?
Thanks. I wish you hadn't asked me this question. But there are a set of standards, and I'm hoping Frank will also be able to come in on this one, that have been developed under the what does the LADM stand for? forgotten what it stands for. It's the Land Administration Domain Model Standard, which is really one of the standards that is, I'm going to post in the chat, I don't know how this will help, is an attempt, and if you look at the International Federation of Surveyors site, they spell out these standards, and it's an attempt to actually sort of come up with some sort of international standard. So in short, yes, there is, but it is something that's still being developed, and some of them people have been adopting. Let me just see, can I put this in the chat? Is it possible? Or just, I'm not sure if I can just, I don't know how to put this in the, here we go.
There it is. We can see it. There it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
yeah, that's what that's my understanding. Yes, there is an attempt to develop these standards, and it's more like a self-regulating standard that has been developed by the international community.
Thank you, Harold. Frank, would you like to add anything to that? Where are we at with creating a sort of an international standard that everyone is using and agrees by? Because it seems to me that's one of the challenges, isn't it?
Indeed. And the ISO standard that Harold references, I think, was passed probably in 2014, 2015, and really began to bring some coherence and standardization. Now, that said, I think we all recognize that each country context is a bit different, and it does need to be contextualized for that country-specific model. But it puts us all in a level playing field in terms of how that data is managed. And in fact, is a big part of our work at Cadasta and looking at these data standards and national data standards to ensure the data captured locally can meet the requirements and ultimately be accepted.
I've got another question here in the chat that I think applies to most regions and is another challenge that we're facing in this space. And the question is, across most countries in Africa, technology has grown way ahead of regulation. What are the legal and policy considerations that such countries should bear in mind while adopting these tech innovations? And I think that we can say that that applies to not only Africa, but across the world. You know, tech is always quicker than laws, we are finding in all sorts of spheres. So, Harold, how can we ensure that, you know, the legal framework can catch up with the technology?
Again, a challenging question. I think, you know, in the end of the day, it's about political will. And indeed, the technology has outpaced, you know, ahead of many of the regulations. I think it was an earlier question by Jonathan as well, I think, which sort of relates to this. And I think some of this is about, it links to some of the discussion we're having now about the recognition of individual rights and the emphasis on registering and allocating individual rights to rights holders, when in fact what we really need as a starting point is the recognition of diverse customary tenure systems, which range from more sort of group right systems to ones that might be sort of a mix of that plus familial rights and access to certain types of land. So really the starting point is the development of those policy legal frameworks that recognize diverse customary tenure systems. I must say, I think, yes, as Jonathan has said, this is one of the challenges, but I think we've seen quite a general thrust towards this, at least in Africa. In other parts of the world, it's a bit mixed. In some, there's already that recognition, but then the issue is, how does that get translated into practice? And so, yes, and the technology in itself, as I think I was trying to say earlier, you know, you have to have that recognition. Yes, with the technology, you can go and you can do all of this mapping, etc. But then it has to have that legal recognition. And then linked to that, though, is also the institutional and capacity building to ensure that those rights can be managed and regulated. You know, if it's being managed as a collective right, that local communities have in fact got the capacity and are able to manage those rights and the transfer of those rights between individuals in their communities. Over.
Yes, thanks, Harold. Frank, can I get your thoughts on that as well? Harold's mentioning that perhaps in Africa, in some countries in Africa, is more advanced in terms of the legal framework to define and regulate all this. Where else are you finding? Are there any countries that are particularly advanced in this process?
Sure, and that question about the legal frameworks is so important, because as we know, we can do all we want with technology, but if the broader governance frameworks aren't in place, does it really matter? And getting those frameworks in place, particularly around land, given the range of government institutions often involved, is so critical. So that, just because we improve the land information system, how are we ensuring that's relating to the planning, to the property tax, to all of the other governance needs? So quite critical there. Now, we've had some success, I think, where customary and statutory, particularly in Africa, are working to align so that there's not that discrepancy between customary de facto land administration that's happening and statutory, legal land administration, where we can align those two, like we're seeing in Ghana and Uganda. There's so much more potential, right? And we don't run into the same conflicts we might see elsewhere.
Thank you, Frank. And Alicia, I'd like to turn to you, because I've got this really interesting question here in the chat, which I think is really relevant and actually not that talked about. It says, when we're talking about digital technology, what do we need to think about when it affects those in voluntary isolation or Indigenous groups with initial contact? Alicia, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, please. I think we've lost Alicia there. Oh no, here we are. Alicia, please go ahead. How do we know, what are the views about the use of technology for Indigenous groups that actually don't want to be part of this, perhaps, are in voluntary isolation for their own reasons?
Bueno, ¿me escuchan?
Yes, we do.
Bien. Todo esto tiene su razón, por la cual las comunidades indígenas se cuenta con esa resiliencia actual, ¿no? Pero también es importante mencionar que para poder, nosotros pasamos esa prueba ya eso lo hemos pasado. Al principio las comunidades indígenas no querían saber de tecnología, incluso cuando empezamos a desarrollar actividades con drones, utilizar imágenes de satélite, digamos, haciendo análisis espaciales, estábamos utilizando dispositivo móvil para colecta de datos, empezamos a hacer una serie de pruebas muy importantes para las comunidades. Pero esto es clave también cuando las comunidades indígenas también se identifican de dónde tú vienes. El derecho al consentimiento libre, previo e informado es clave para esto. No puedes pasar de eso sin haber primero entendido cuál es el engranaje de la política interna de estos pueblos. Las políticas internas de estos pueblos van más allá todavía del derecho a que se le vulnere en el caso de que se le va a extraer una información. Más allá todavía, nosotros iniciamos una prueba de acercamiento que era difícil, primero, que las comunidades entendieran para qué era eso, porque todo para ellos es una amenaza, todo. En este sentido, nosotros empezamos un proceso de socialización en materia de recursos, trabajar fuertemente y de lleno también a identificarse un poco sobre las actividades que ellos consideraban de mayor prioridad y que era necesario atenderlo. Y uno de los temas era tierra, otro de los temas era bosque y otro de los temas era el agua y también la participación comunitaria. Era difícil primero interpretar lo que ellos querían, porque todos estaban en distintos idiomas. Y era clave también definir quién iba a ser el elemento que pudiese socializar esa información, que no cualquiera lo puede hacer. Y tiene que ser seleccionado por ellos mismos. Una vez que sea seleccionado por ellos mismos, entramos en un proceso de de organización de información para que sea, digamos, cumpliendo un proceso de trazabilidad interno, local, y que garantice a ello que la información que se estaba generando o que se está desarrollando sea de alta confianza y de credibilidad. Esa es la primera tarea. La segunda tarea es salir de ahí con la información que ellos ya disponieron y elevarlo entonces a una mesa de trabajo técnica, científica, ahora con la institución, para precisamente hacer lo que ya estamos conversando, que es la valorización jurídica de esta información. No te creas, pasamos 2 años, más de 3 años para conseguir la valorización jurídica de la información, digamos, de sistema de información geográfica, cartográfica, topográfica, con la institución, hasta que pudiesen entender, y esto se debe gracias también a la lucha que la CONAPI emprendió junto con las autoridades tradicionales de este país, y también llamando digamos así, presionando a las instituciones responsables que tiene que ver con materia de datos geodésicos, en brindar la calidad jurídica de esto y también certificar esta información. Entonces, en la actualidad ya rompimos esa barrera. Y yo lo que sí le quería, yo lo que sí le quería mencionar era esto, lo siguiente. Cuando se habla de tecnología, hay información de alta confiabilidad o de alto perfil que no se puede sistematizar. Por eso que toda la información que generamos se hace de forma cerrada. No sé si, bueno, en la presentación lo puse, pero la información que se genera es de forma cerrada y no enviándolo a un portal, ya que esto no tenemos control a ello. La información que tú generes mediante una aplicación, ejemplo, una aplicación ODK, tú lo desarrollas, tiene una plataforma en Estados Unidos, digamos, un soporte en Estados Unidos. La información, una vez que conecte, ese dispositivo se conecte con una red Wi-Fi o un punto de acceso a Internet, inmediatamente se va automatizada. Y esta información automatizada no tenemos control de ella, por eso las comunidades indígenas dicen, bueno, vamos a participar en un proceso de sistematización automatizada de esta información, pero no queremos que nos esté llevando los materiales vegetales de aquí o el material vegetal aquí sin haber pasado el proceso de derecho y propiedad intelectual, ni mucho menos el consentimiento libre previo informado. Podemos participar como un plan piloto para conocer cómo es ese proceso automatizado y cómo es ese proceso cerrado que nosotros sí tenemos el control, porque sí sabemos decir, Ministerio de Ambiente, esta es la información que tenemos y estas son las coordenadas. Ten. Pero si se automatiza, posiblemente es una ventaja para nosotros, pero una desventaja también porque no tenemos el control del mismo. Y también se nos puede escapar de la mano si la plataforma jurídicamente tampoco tiene un proceso reconocido y tampoco avalado por las autoridades tradicionales que también tienen interés de esa información. Hasta ahí lo dejo. Gracias.
Thank you, Alicia. It's really important to bear in mind what you are saying, because when we talk about technology, you have just told us, at the beginning, how challenging it was amongst your own communities who saw this as a threat. There was confusion, there was mistrust about this process. And then also, as you were saying, 2-3 years it took to get this information legally binding and acknowledged by the government. So it's a huge complex process where you have to have everyone on board. And it really, I think, comes down to this question, this issue of how to build credibility and trust. There is a question here, which Alicia, I'm going to turn to you because I think you'll be best positioned to answer. So there is a person on the chat saying, great, in our communities, we would like to use technology, but it can't be in an equitable way, because simply we don't have even cell phone service, we don't have phone service, we don't have computers, that technology. So when you're starting from that base, how can Indigenous communities be part of this solution when obviously hard to reach forest communities simply don't have access to even a cell phone? Alicia, how do we break that kind of barrier?
Bueno, bastante pregunta en una sola. Yo te digo la experiencia que ya hemos pasado. Por eso se dice que toda esta información es cerrada. Primero, nosotros, mediante un ejercicio desarrollado con la FAO, en el 2016 hicimos 2 pruebas. Primero, utilizar equipos y aplicaciones disponibles, sin necesidad de internet, sin necesidad, solamente con conexión a satélite, solamente era eso. Nos funcionó muy bien y la FAO nos traía una serie de aplicaciones que era necesario conectarse a un portal, a una red, a un soporte de Wi-Fi, todo esto, y no nos funcionó. No nos funcionó, yo le fui claro, no nos funciona. ¿Por qué? Porque primero, nosotros no todo el tiempo tenemos internet. Segundo, las comunidades son extremadamente difíciles. Y tercero, el territorio es extremadamente complicado también de caminar, por la cual hay lluvia, tenemos que pasar ríos, tenemos que pasar horas debajo de un bosque, días en la montaña, y yo no puedo utilizar una aplicación que no me funcione. Bien, en el caso de los software, le voy a mencionar una experiencia que pasamos el año pasado cuando estábamos utilizando los software libres. En este caso hay un software que está en constante desarrollo, pero es importante para que la comunidad lo tenga. En este caso estamos trabajando con Quantum Keys, ¿verdad? No con ArcKeys. Entonces, ¿cuál es la diferencia? En Panamá, tú no puedes utilizar un Quantum Keys, que es un software libre, para presentarle un documento oficial o un plano cartográfico al Estado, porque el Estado no reconoce ese software jurídicamente aquí, reconoce jurídicamente un software que le dicen ArcGIS, ¿verdad? Esto lo que provoca es que de todas formas necesitamos de un soporte de una organización o una persona que esté utilizando este tipo de software porque sí tiene la licencia. Y como es un software libre, inmediatamente le cortas el derecho a la comunidad de presentar sus propuestas técnicas mediante planos cartográficos o una serie de información. Ahora, ¿qué hacemos nosotros? En el desarrollo de estas actividades nos enteramos que en Honduras, en un municipio, en un plan piloto que estaba desarrollando la FAO también, el gobierno en Honduras certificó el uso oficial del Quantum Keys para desarrollar una metodología de seguimiento y trazabilidad sobre las actividades de tenencia. Esto nos dice a nosotros que no solamente Panamá puede incluir eso, sino que también otros países que también tienen estos problemas en temas de economía para que las comunidades indígenas tengan acceso a estas herramientas, pueden hacerlo. Vamos por el tercero ahora. ¿Cómo hacemos ahora para que nosotros, las comunidades indígenas, hagamos el desarrollo de los datos cerrados? Bueno, primero nosotros hacemos una base de datos geográfico con toda la información que podamos recabar de tanto presente y del pasado y presente, más que nada. Y presentándolo entonces para el futuro mediante participación comunitaria. En eso, las comunidades indígenas le llevamos un teléfono móvil con una aplicación, en este caso Locus Map, que es una aplicación versátil y tiene la capacidad para incluir diferentes tipos de elementos o capas dentro de ella. Y ahí también le llevamos un backup de información, de sistema de información geográfico, y le llevamos los software, que es gratuito. Le explicamos cada uno de estos procesos para que ellos entiendan que está en constante desarrollo y cualquier cambio, ellos pueden también identificar esos elementos que están dentro de los software en desarrollo. Ahora, ¿qué hacen las comunidades? Las comunidades, los técnicos de las comunidades se seleccionan. Las autoridades tradicionales de los territorios seleccionan a sus técnicos. Estos técnicos tienen un grado de conocimiento sobre computadora, sobre términos técnicos y también facilita el proceso de análisis. Entonces, posterior a eso, entonces se le empieza a dar un proceso de seguimiento. No es cualquier entrenamiento, no es un taller para llenar cuota, no, es un taller de procesos que va desde cero hasta niveles avanzados. En el caso de nosotros, estamos en niveles avanzados hasta análisis espacial, utilizando Google Engine. Ya tenemos mucha información ya y eso nos está ayudando muchísimo también a los geoprocesos que hemos estado desarrollando. Ahora, estas comunidades, cada uno inician con un proceso básico. de entrenamiento. Posterior a desarrollar toda esa información, se hace la convocatoria a las comunidades para presentarla, cuál ha sido y por qué la importancia de esos datos y cómo ellos pueden ser partícipe en la ejecución por año, por meses, por semanas, de acuerdo a la situación tenencial que tengan. Ese sería mi aporte.
Gracias. Thank you, Eliseo. There is another question on the chat, which I think is worth exploring. And we have touched on it a bit, but maybe if I can get a bit more of your insight, Harold and Frank, on this question. The question is, how open are governments to receive maps produced by non-state organizations? I'm assuming also that would be obviously indigenous groups, forest communities that have different standards. So for example, again, we're talking about this standardization of maps and who agrees whether what map can be admitted for whatever reason. In your experiences, where have you been working, have the governments been open to receiving different kinds of maps that are not the so-called official maps? Who would like to take that question first? Perhaps Frank, can I turn to you, please? And then Harold.
Sure, happy to take a first cut at that. Similar to the land administration domain model, bringing a little bit of a sea change in 2012 in the thinking about how about data standards. With FIG and the World Bank's paper on fit for purpose land administration in 2014, 2015, we saw a real change in, I think, the professional surveying sector. There are alternative approaches to collecting data that can incrementally be strengthened and made more accurate. And I think that's been somewhat slow to be accepted by governments, but is very gradually and perceptibly becoming becoming accepted. And in part because governments are recognizing that 100% cadastral and registry coverage that is centimeter accurate is a pipe dream and is millennia away at our current levels of progress being made. But more incremental approaches will allow us to close the gap using technology in a more cost-effective way. But what governments don't want is in turn communities just showing up or individuals showing up and saying, here's my claim, right? Let's process it. Because there are standards, there are laws, there are precedents and land rights, which really, I think, just highlights that need for communities to be looking at these national standards ahead of the mapping, because you don't want all of this effort to be wasted when you then go to government and have a great case for advocacy as to why this land belongs to this community, but it just is never going to legally meet the requirements.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And over to you, Harold. Have you had any particular experience in governments that are perhaps more open than others in receiving different types of information by different types of people that they are perhaps in the past not used to receiving? In your experience, has there been a government or governments that stands out for that?
Unfortunately, it's perhaps the challenge is more the issue about. I think it's a good question. By the way, I see there's been a lot of questions posted in the Q&A as well as the chat. So I've been jumping between the two, but answering most of these in the Q&A. So I don't know if that's being shared with everybody, because I think I answered this one, but I can't even find the answer I gave just a few minutes ago. But I think it is a challenge. It is really a challenge to get governments to accept work that is being done by NGOs, civil society organizations. And I think the key really is about involving them early on in the process. But yes, there are examples. I mean, for me, from my own experience in Mozambique, for example, there are certain standards that are set by government, but then as long as NGOs are showing that they are following procedures, that there's been the right type of consultations, indicating who has been consulted, etc., the documentation of the process, then the process is accepted. And there are other countries that are are sort of following suit, but my mind has gone blank right now. But yes, it is. I think the key, though, is really, if possible, to the extent possible, involving at some point early on a certain level of validation from the local authorities in the process. They don't have to be part of the process all the way, but getting them involved early on, at least in some of the meetings, is an important step to getting their acceptance of the process.
Thank you. I think we have, Alicia was talking about his own community's experiences in Panama about, the process and the complex process that communities have to go through to adopt technologies. But I'd like to have a bit of insight from Frank and Harold on this. There's a question here in the chat that says, which other people have made the point that, using technology and digital tools is really capital intensive. And the idea is, once you have often pilot projects, how do you then scale these up? And the exact question is, what strategies from your experience have you worked in to ensure that there's a progressive use of technologies in land administration through resource allocation by government? So I think that the idea is, how do you then, once you have a pilot project, how do you then scale that up to become more mainstream and widespread among communities in a particular country? Frank, would you like to have a go at having a go at that question, please?
Sure. No, and a tough question there. On one hand, I would argue that new technology is perhaps less capital intensive than some of the traditional surveying technology. That is, with a smartphone for $100 or $200, everybody can now capture 3 to 5 meter positional accuracy data. That's a tremendous advancement in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think that opens up the door to some incremental capture of data that can then be improved upon. And that's, of course, where it would be greater cost as you take that, 3 to 5 meter to sub-meter accuracy, and as the value of the land might dictate. Now, how do we think about the scaling up? And in part, it is that. It's how do we start with the low-end technology, use of imagery, use of smartphones for initial demarcation that can then be improved upon. But it's also, how do we link the property rights to something else and ensure that individuals and communities are benefiting from something and not just a piece of paper, that they can see that their rights are being protected, that perhaps they're benefiting from some government services now being provided, that it's linking them to markets, et cetera. There needs to be that clear linkage between citizens and the government, that there's a benefit for engaging in land administration, because it does bring with it a cost. Going and registering that land is a cost, and in turn, it's a responsibility now for that citizen that it is part of the bureaucracy to maintain the land, pay a property tax as might be relevant, et cetera.
Thank you, Frank. And Harold, over to you for the same question, please. What are your thoughts?
As Frank says, it's quite a challenging one. And I actually wanted to start with an example of a solution where it's not about the technology. So, for example, in Ethiopia, what's called the first level certification, there's no use of technology. It's all about local land administration officers at the lowest level, and it's about local processes, communities walking boundaries, agreeing that this is a person's land. In the highland areas, it's much more individualized versus the lowlands, which is collective group lands, but each family agreeing, yes, this is my neighbor's land, etc. And you get a certificate, and let's say the central state has no idea where that land is. So, let us not lose sight of those solutions. Actually, better to start like that, and then to start to develop the technology and the capacities as you go forward. And I think, yes, Frank has said much of it. New technologies, the cost is coming down all the time. The other thing that Frank said that I very much like, it's about the fit for purpose. Again, that it's an evolving system. So, do you need sub-meter accuracy in a remote rural area? Is it because it's not about the accuracy of the point, it's more about the agreement between neighbors on where those boundaries are? And if you are, as Frank says, between 3 to 5 meters, you're pretty much there. Whereas in an urban area, then maybe eventually you need a high level of precision, high level of cost, which eventually then the users can start paying for. But now to get that sort of fit for purpose, that sort of standard that Frank said, 3 to 5 meters, that is again the issue of the policy and legislative framework. So, the one way of reducing the cost is by reducing the standards and the requirements. And that again is sometimes there's a bit of work that's needed to be done with the professionals, especially in government, in reducing those standards. The other thing, I agree with Frank, it's about, as communities become incentivized, I think, the initial registration can be done by a state on a systematic basis. We systematically register land, and that brings down the cost. But then the subsequent transactions on that land, if there's an emerging land market, for example, then perhaps that needs to be managed by local community institutions, like a village land registry, for example, in Tanzania, if I use an example. And then maybe it is paid by the user, but the cost is much lower, and they do it on a demand-driven basis. So those are some of the ways in which one can address the issues of long-term sustainability, moving from a sort of a pilot to a scale-up.
Thank you very much, Harold. And Alicia, I'm coming back to you because we kind of touched on this at the beginning, where we talked about that, there are also pitfalls and risks with using new technologies. But I think it's worth sort of summing up what have been the challenges, or particularly in your experience of using digital tools in your Indigenous community. So Alicia, the question is, it's a general one, but if you could focus on a couple of examples, perhaps. The question is, what are the negative consequences of using new technologies in land governance? What have been particular challenges? You talked about initially that some Indigenous communities saw it as a threat. There was a long process of raising awareness about what it means and what it can do. But if you could summarize the challenges again that you've been facing. Alicia, over to you. While Alicia is going to come to us, I'm going to then ask the same question to Harold and Frank. The pitfalls, the risks, how would we define them? Here we are, Alicia, here we are. Yes, over to you, please.
Dame un momentito que perdí la traducción. No lo encuentro.
Shall I ask the question again? The question was, what are the negative consequences or the challenges of using new technologies, digital tools, in land governance and monitoring that you and your communities have experienced?
Es que no tengo el traductor en español aquí.
Okay, I can say the question to you in Spanish if you like.
Dame un momentito y yo le respondo. Dame un momentito y yo le respondo.
Okay, I'm then going to ask Harold. Harold, what have you found to be the pitfalls? Obviously, it varies region to region, but there are any sort of challenges that communities need to think of before they, embark on this kind of use of technology? Harold or Frank, would you like to answer, please? Harold, off you go.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, sure. I wasn't sure if you were asking us.
Yes, sorry, it was, yes.
Yeah, I think there are many, and it really, some of it comes back to, in whose hands is the technology? If you come, but then this is a general point. It's not just about technology. It's how do outsiders come and engage with local communities when we think there's a service or a benefit, or, and especially in terms of government services and so on. If you come, the key is about involving people at the start and explaining what is being done, etc. If you came into a community, as I remember once happening many years ago, and you've got a sort of an aerial on your back and you're walking around and you're not talking to people and you're mapping and so on, immediately people get very suspicious and they think you're coming in and you're going to steal their land. And not without good reason sometimes. So it's really how you come into it. That being said, I've always been amazed, the use of, for example, satellite imagery or aerial photography. Come in to a community, sit down, show an aerial photography, start discussing with them, how, their own resource use, look what's going on, and them explaining to you. It's amazing how people interact with that sort of technology, and that becomes a tool for them digitizing and getting their worldview into a national perspective. The other thing is, what we now see increasingly in many parts of the world, is the use of mobile phones, and these are the tools that are, really for mapping, for GPS, etc. People are using these tools. They're no longer foreign tools for people. So I think that's one of the challenges around technology. There are others that are always referred to as the logistical. And that's where, especially when you're wanting to add volume, training people, enabling them to capture, upload that data into a system, it's not as easy as you think. It's as you said it, Anastasia, the technology in itself is not the magic bullet. There's the social dimension, which is about putting the hands in the technology in the hands of the people, and then there's the sort of the logistical, which is, things go wrong on the day, getting things lined up, the pure logistics of being able to register land. And I think those are some of the key challenges.
Thanks. I'm going to move to Frank, and then Alicia, if you could stand by for the same question, please. Frank.
Sure. I think one of the things we see on the mapping side and applying technology to land administration is this idea of the perfect tool, right? The perfect tool is going to fix everything. And if we build the perfect tool just right, it will address the challenge. When I think, as Harold alluded to, oftentimes the biggest challenge aren't technology related. It's governance. It's building that community understanding and developing community bylaws. So starting with a technology that gets you 70 or 80% of the way there, but lets you get started and get working right away, is probably, from my perspective, a much better decision than trying to build out the perfect tool for a singular situation that then you're going to have a problem maintaining in the future as well. So starting with the basics, there's a lot off the shelf, building from that, and then as the experience dictates, refining. Just some considerations for our partners as they begin their work.
Thank you. And Alicia, would you like to answer that question? Are you with us?
Sí, correcto.
So,
¿Podrías volver a
of course.
la pregunta?
Of course, yes. We've been discussing the challenges and the perhaps negative consequence of using digital tools and technology in land governance. You mentioned some of the challenges. Are there negative consequences that you have found in your communities? What have been the main challenges when using tech to monitor your lands and for land governance?
Bueno, interesante la pregunta. Uno de los desafíos que hemos más que nada encontrado en el camino es el acceso al acompañamiento por las instituciones del Estado. Por ahí empezamos primero. Ha sido complicado porque ese es un deber de ellos, y el derecho de nosotros es exigir ese acompañamiento y también que la tecnología sea acompañada también por la garantía jurídica de estas instituciones que son responsables para que las comunidades entiendan de que también ellos se sientan respaldados por el Estado. Pero en realidad no es así. Para llegar a este nivel ha pasado muchas pruebas, y es interesante también mencionar que otro de los desafíos es que permanentemente, a pesar de que se ha estado desarrollando metodología, utilizando la herramienta de punta, digamos así, de alta tecnología, aún todavía no existe una política clara sobre cómo disminuir los problemas de los territorios. Y si trabajamos a nivel de gobernanza, también hemos encontrado que la participación en las instituciones todavía no es claro, porque cada uno juega un papel importante en minimizar estos hallazgos que en los territorios indígenas que muchos años anda reclamando. Un ejemplo claro, hemos encontrado zonas con recursos minerales que por muchos años han sido protegidos por las comunidades y aún así se han emitido denuncias y el Estado no dice nada. Hemos encontrado personas que destruyen la vida silvestre, matando de 20, 30 animales solamente para vender. Y cuando se le hace un proceso de denuncia, no va preso, no hay nada. Entonces, esto ha sido titánico. El desafío por la adaptación política según la situación de gobernanza y la lucha por defender los recursos. El otro desafío importante que siempre le hemos estado mencionando es que el tema de la tecnología debe ser sostenible ante las comunidades indígenas, por la cual es complicado porque mucho de esto requiere de recursos. Se ha estado estableciendo convenios de apoyo de cooperación con el Estado, pero en realidad no son todas las instituciones responsables ante esto que estén cumpliendo. Otro desafío es que a corto plazo se garantice la seguridad jurídica de los territorios y evitar el tema de la burocracia institucional, que es un desafío que permanentemente cada año y cada gobierno establece su propio libro para poder entonces dilatar las acciones de derecho a la tierra. También hemos encontrado un importante desafío en el desarrollo de las capacidades. Es que constantemente logré alcanzar a escuchar el tema de los datos, el tema de la precisión de los datos. Yo estoy plenamente seguro que si nosotros trabajamos con datos que no requerimos de alta precisión, muchas cosas se verán resuelto. Porque una cosa importante ante la precisión de los datos es la oficialización de la inspección ocular que se desarrolla en terreno. Eso es clave, porque en la inspección ocular tú puedes definir físicamente dónde está esa coordenada y ubicar a esas parcelas o esas personas que tienen un conflicto tenencial, simplemente haciéndole una caracterización de la zona y explicando la ubicación específicamente de eso. No, pero el Estado quiere que se haga de manera precisa, con instrumentos que cuesten de $27,000, que no genera nada, simplemente es un proceso. Entonces, para el Estado está bien, para nosotros no está bien, pero tenemos que adaptarnos a eso también. Entonces, ha sido un desafío crucial y la tecnología, las comunidades indígenas poco a poco lo han ido adaptando, porque sabemos que si nos quedamos sin utilizar estos recursos tecnológicos y haciendo toda la mezcla de estos instrumentos, nosotros no nos podemos defender. Aún así, todavía están viendo que si las comunidades indígenas tienen mucha información, es una amenaza para el Estado también, porque sabemos dónde pegarle, ¿verdad? Entonces, de igual forma, hemos estado también haciendo alianzas con organizaciones solidarias y empresas privadas para reforzar poco a poco la gestión que se está desarrollando a través de la Coordinadora Nacional de Pueblo Indígena y también la voluntad de los jóvenes que han estado voluntariamente apoyando en estos procesos y que en algún día se le llegue a reconocer ante el Estado y que tengamos un convenio para poder entonces contar con recursos económicos de manera permanente para poder ayudar también al gobierno y a estas instituciones a hacer su trabajo, ya que no lo pueden hacer. Eso sería mi intervención.
Thank you, Alicia. I think you've touched on a couple of points that we've already discussed in this session, the idea of political will and the role of the government in all this, and also the sustainability of projects and how to maintain and renew the digital tools. But overall, I think the impression I'm getting from your message is that tech is really important as a tool with which to defend your territories. And it seems to me that from what you're saying, that the advantages definitely outweigh the risks and pitfalls. So I'm conscious of time. We've got about 4 minutes. I'd like to ask a final question to each of my panelists, please. A forward-looking question, if you could summarize in a minute each, please. what are the future trends here? What are the exciting tech tools that are going to come out? Harold, you mentioned at the beginning, the use of blockchain, perhaps to decentralize data, which seems very exciting and new. What digital tools would you like to be using more and seeing more of in the future? Frank, a forward-looking, trend-setting answer, please, if we can.
Sure. For me, it's the decentralization of land administration, the ability, connectivity of digital tools, et cetera, to allow for local governments to play a leading role in those land governance transactions, so that for rural communities, it isn't seen as something from a disconnected government, the capital, that is too expensive to access, too difficult to reach, and a never-ending bureaucratic process. And instead is something that can be done locally by a district official that is known, and increasing to while we're not there yet in 100% activity, we're moving very quickly. And places that I wouldn't have thought were possible, we're now seeing sub county land offices connected to national land information systems. So you're having that transparency.
Thank you. And Harold, if you want to mention a bit more about blockchain, or are there any other exciting trends that you think we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the future when it comes to land governance and the use of digital tools?
Actually, I mentioned blockchain, but some of my partners and collaborators from FAO and others would shoot me down on that one, because I think actually from many of the, I think, actually something we learned, perhaps what I learned in the process is 4 or 5 years ago, blockchain was seen as the new solution, and it's kind of fallen out of flavor at the moment. It's less seen as a solution. I think many actually now say that maybe it's not really a solution. It's too soon to say. So I think some of the other technologies that people are referring to, and I'm not an expert in these things, I'm also learning on the job, and many of these things are things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is one potential tool. An interesting thing that came out of our interviews are things like face recognition, simple ways of providing identification to people, which is one of the big challenges, in fact, faced. So some of the work, and then I think already mentioned, and I know Claudia has posted on the work that they've been doing in the use of drones. I think that's actually something that's quite interesting. But I agree with Frank. I always like to say we don't need Rolls Royces, we need bicycles. We need a lot of bicycles. So let us not lose sight of the simpler, more basic technologies that really can do the job, and are cheaper, affordable, and easier to put into the hands of the people, which still goes back to simple GIS, low accuracy GIS, perhaps open source, a lot of discussion around open source GIS, but simple GIS information systems, and that's basically enough. And in many ways, and satellite imagery. For me, aerial photography, satellite imagery, along with drones where it's needed, those are, for me, are actually still the solutions. But I'll go back to my point I made about Ethiopia. Maybe the thing is about starting with, not with the technology. So how are you going to go about systematically mapping? How do you work? How do you build on participatory mapping exercises that communities do? Start with that, and then start to think about how do you digitize and then get that into national information systems. So really, let's not lose sight of the basics.
Thank you. Alicia, apologies. We've come now to the end of the webinar session. I won't have time to get back to you, but I just wanted to sum up. I think really the key message here is that everything's got to start with the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. I think that we can agree that that is the basis of all this and the use of any new technologies. I'd like to thank Alicia from Panama, Harold, Frank. Thank you so much for a really great discussion. Thank you to the hundreds of people that have been
Solamente agregar la
Alicia.
biblioteca virtual. Solamente agregar la biblioteca virtual en los lugares donde no hay acceso a información. y ahí es clave para poder ayudar a estas comunidades. Ya hemos estado desarrollando esa prueba, tenemos experiencia ya en eso, gracias a Dios. Bueno, saludos y un placer.
We'll be looking forward to seeing that virtual library develop over the years. And thank you for all your great questions, and a good afternoon and good morning to wherever you are. Thank you. Goodbye.